And there we go. All right, so we are going over the 2003 DBQ, which was on FDR and the New Deal. Now, we didn't talk about this in class very often, so or didn't get to this before the shutdown. So I'll have to do some background information, and that's why on this DBQ Success of the New Deal, I had you do a very simplistic, and this is another methodology for doing background information. I had you do a more simplistic version where you list out people, places, events, and dates that would pertain to the actual question. So in 2003, the actual question was analyze the responses of Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration to the problems of the Great Depression. How effective were these responses? How did they change the role of the federal government? So this is taking a position one way or the other. Either FDR was very good or FDR was a failure. And then, of course, you can waffle on this type of question. You can say there were good things and bad. So if they give you that type of question, obviously you can answer it in a multitude of ways, but we'll get to that here in a bit. Now, since we know that this is about the New Deal, the time period we're talking about is going to be the 1930s and 40s. So as I listed out here, you know, people, obviously FDR and his wife Eleanor would be people to talk about, but there are going to be others as well. And we're talking about individuals like Huey Long from Louisiana, who was a senator. Huey Long was an architect of what he called the Share the Wealth program, where he was promoting the idea that FDR was not going far enough, that FDR could have gone and done more with the programs, that he wasn't doing enough to help out the poor people, and especially in regions that were being affected differently. So if you remember, the Great Depression kind of is called that because it affected a vast multitude of different people. It was businessmen, it was shareholders, it was bankers, but it was also farmers, and it was people that were working in factories that were shutting down or businesses that were closing. So this was affecting all facets of the American economy during the 1930s. So Huey Long was saying, hey, you're not doing enough to handle everything. You're not going across the board. Meanwhile, there were people like Charles Coughlin, who was the radio priest, and Charles Coughlin was kind of saying at that point that, hey, this is too much. This is too much of a big government overreach, that the government's in charge of way too much. So you had some people that were detracting from what FDR was trying to do and saying that FDR was just going too far with what he was proposing in New Deal legislation. Then there were other people that were part of the New Deal, whether it be Harry Hopkins, who was actually running and the architect of most of the New Deal legislation, Francis Perkins, who was the very first female of late important position on the cabinet when you had high levels of unemployment. She became that kind of became a go-to person, a go-to advisor by FDR. And FDR is also going to look at holding his feet to the flames, that, hey, you've got programs that are helping out men, but you don't have any that are really helping out women. What about the women that don't have a husband, that don't have a father that is, getting government assistance? How do we assist women to get into the workforce and to, kind of handle their own business, if you will, during an economic downturn? Then you also have the Black Cabinet under Mary McLeod Bethune that was saying, hey, African Americans are not getting an equal share within the New Deal legislation, that, a lot of this New Deal legislation is helping out whites, but blacks in the inner city are not getting the same help. So you had a multitude of different people that are involved in the New Deal programs. You can also bring up people like John Steinbeck, who was writing at the time about the Dust Bowl, the region in the American Midwest and Great Plains that was hit by a massive drought in the 1930s. And he was writing books like Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath. So there again, you can kind of list out people that you just kind of remember from the time period. And I didn't expect you, period. We didn't talk about this. So this is my way of kind of not only presenting this as, hey, this was a 4 question, but also to review the material that we never really got to. When it comes to places involved in the New Deal, as I just mentioned, the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl predominantly was in areas like Kansas, Nebraska, and the main one that always gets cited is Oklahoma. The reason is the people who were affected by it were known as Okies. Okay, the people that were affected by the Dust Bowl, the banks lost their land, lost their farms because of lack of payment, because of lack of economic ability to pay the bills, if you will. When these people have their land foreclosed upon, they go west. They go out towards California to what they called the land of milk and honey, where they were searching for jobs. So you could, when you're talking about places, you're talking about the Dust Bowl in the Midwest, you're talking, and Great Plains for that matter, and then you're also talking about going out to California with this idea that there are jobs out there. Of course, you can talk about, as I listed there, New York City and Washington, D.C. as kind of the area did first. You know, New York City with the stock exchange, stock market crash in 1929, that's certainly going to be an area that gets affected. And then, of course, Washington come in to prominence, if you will, during this time period. If you really want to get technical, is you can look at places that either produced programs like the South with the Civilian Conservation Corps. You can look at certain programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority, we are kind of promotes and pushes for. Obviously, you can talk about the stock market and for that matter. All 4 of those were FDR. FDR won all 4 of those elections. Remember, he was the only president to serve more than 2 terms as president of the United States, and he died at the very beginning of that 4th term. But of course, we're also talking about other events like World War II starts, at least for us, in 1941 after Pearl Harbor. And then you can also talk about, how World War II was kind of on the fringe before that, because it really started in September of 1939. Other events that you can possibly point to, you can talk about FDR's death in 1945, in the early stages of 45. That's at the very tail end of the question kind of time frame. You can also talk about events that happened during the New Deal when legislation was passed. You can talk about the events of Hoover's presidency comparative to FDR, that Hoover tried to do things, but it always seemed to blow up in his face. If he pushed for a tariff that would protect American industries, a retaliatory tariff from another country would just raise prices and hurt the American consumer. So Hoover tried to do things. He had public works programs to build what eventually became known as the Hoover Dam, named for him, which brought jobs, but in the long run, it was just that the American people needed at that point. It was just too compared to what FDR was bringing promises in its time frames. So don't feel like, man, I don't remember what day that actually happened on. It doesn't matter. Regardless, if you talk about the event, we know what you mean. Okay, so an AP grader is not going to be impressed when you pull out, oh, and this happened on September 15th, 1932. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. If you know that there was an election in that year, it's good enough. It doesn't matter when election day was, doesn't matter when inauguration day was. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you remember the specific day of an assassination. It doesn't matter if you remember the specific day of a policy. AP is not concerned. At no point on that rubric is a date all that important. So when dates come up, the real thing is, do you know the progression? That's what they're concerned about. Do you understand how this, and the effect was this? And we've been working on that throughout the year, but I wanted to make sure you understood that that's what the AP board means when they're talking about time frames. They want to know that you understand that the Great Depression started and was not caused by specifically one event, because a lot of AP students and really historical students in general mess up the idea that the stock market didn't cause the Great Depression. Most people say, oh, the stock market crashed and then the Great Depression occurred. Didn't happen that way. So teachable moment, let's make sure we understand this for the AP. The stock market crash in 1929 was bad. It certainly was. But the vast majority of the American people didn't have their money in the stock market. It took time for the economy of the United States to be impacted by roughly 2% of the population losing out on some funding. It's not like every American had money in the stock market. Most couldn't afford to play the game, if you will. So it took time for this to filter down into the economy, and for the roaring 20s mentality and the laissez-faire policies to kind of blow up in our faces, to where businesses were not reporting properly how much money they were making. It was misleading investors. It was misleading people on the stock market. It certainly impacted over time. So all of a sudden, these businesses are starting to constrict their production. They're starting to constrict their workforce. So people are losing their wages. They're losing their jobs. They can't pay their bills. When they can't pay their bills, the banks start to shut down. When the banks start to shut down, people start making a run on the bank, hoping that they can hold on to their money because there was no safety net. And this brought up a lot of problems. The Great Depression proved that we did not have the social safety net, and more importantly, the economic safety net to save these people. There was no unemployment. There was no FDIC, which was another program that FDR is going to bring in his New Deal, one of the most successful programs, I might add. The FDIC is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That's the group that made sure that when you deposit money into a bank, it is insured by the federal government. That way, if you go in and you've got, let's say, $500 in your bank account at Fifth Third, and then Fifth Third up and says, you know what, we had bad business this year, we got to shut our door, we're closing, your account is still insured by the federal government. Okay, so that also allows the government to get involved with Fifth Third to make sure the bank is doing the right things. So there's kind of a give and take, if you will, between the banking industry and the government to make sure everything's above board so that your money is protected and safe when you go to the bank. This was not the case prior to the Great Depression. So all these things, it was kind of the perfect storm of economic stupidity that happened during the 1920s and early 30s to create the do when the economy took massive unemployment because people were being furloughed or laid off by their jobs in an economic downturn. What's the government immediately doing? They're bolstering the idea that your banking is okay. They're trying to get out the idea that, hey, there's going to be some stimulus money. There's going to be unemployment available. Don't panic. Everything's going to be fine. They're trying to create a level of calm in a sea of uncertainty, if you will, because they realize that laissez-faire, it causes panic, and that panic grows exponentially. So that was kind of the lesson of the Great Depression and FDR's policies, if you will. So again, when you're laying all this out, notice I'm kind of having you do this before you ever look at the documents, because when you get to remember, where can I place this into the progression, if you will? How can I frame my mind about the context of the question? So if we're talking 1930s and 40s, what do you remember about the 1930s and 40s? And you may were coming from, what were some of the causes? Like just bring up with the 1920s. We're talking about laissez-faire policies. You may want to kind of include Calvin Coolidge's Roaring 20s policy, and we're using trickle-down economics, and the economy's booming, but it's going to crash because of that. You can throw in places, that certain cities are growing during that time period. That you are just coming off a great migration where African Americans are moving to the north. All these things are going to have economic impact in the long term. And of course, you can talk about the events of the 1920s as well. Something like this chart, I didn't have to look that up. Document A was Meridel Lesueur. Who the hell is she? No clue. Doesn't matter. Okay, Meridel Lesueur, who's writing in New Masses in January of 1932. The only thing you need to remember about that is by that point, FDR is not president yet. He has been elected, but he's not taken the oath of office. Inauguration day wouldn't happen until March of that year. So Hoover's still the president at this point. Fine. And when they're out of work and hungry, there are not many women in the bread line. There are no flop houses for women as there are for men, where a bed can be had for a quarter or less. You don't see women lying on the floor of the mission in free flops. They obviously don't sleep under newspapers in the park. There is no law, I suppose, against their being in these places, but in fact, they rarely are. Yet, there must be as many women out of jobs in cities and suffering extreme poverty as there are men. What happens to them? So this is framing the argument, and this is the point of view of Meridel, that whatever the government's doing and whatever these private charities are doing for men, they're not doing for women. So it's raising the question, what's happening to these people? Where are they supposed to turn? There's no program set up for them. And that's kind of incumbent upon the government and the society to come up with a plan. And that's kind of the perspective that that person is going to take with that. Document B, letter to Senator Robert Wagner. So this is obviously a constituent, somebody that lives in the state that Robert Wagner is the senator from. And this is March 7th, 1934. So this is into the first year of FDR as president. So this is after the New Deal has started, okay? And the New Deal, yet again, was this massive group of programs that FDR comes into the presidency with to fix the Great Depression. This is his plan to fix the economic downturn. Okay, and again, he was trying to do 3 R's. The 3 R's of the New Deal were relief, recovery, and reform. Relieving people from massive unemployment and an economic downturn, recovering from the economics, so trying to get the economy back up and running, and reform to make sure it never happens again. Okay, so this person is writing to Robert Wagner, a senator, and it says, it seems very apparent to me that the administration at Washington is accelerating its pace towards socialism and communism. Remember, socialism and communism are not exactly popular. They're extremist belief structures at this point. We have just come off in the 1920s a Red Scare where everybody's concerned about people becoming communist, and it's going to happen again in the 1950s. So during this time period, for them to call somebody a communist, it's not a good thing, okay? Nearly every public statement from Washington is against stimulation of business, which would, in the end, create employment. Everyone is sympathetic to the cause of creating more jobs and better wages for labor, but a program continually promoting labor troubles, higher wages, shorter hours, and less profits for business would seem to me to be leading us fast to a condition where the government must more and more expand its relief activities and will lead to the end of the disaster for all classes. So this person is saying we're going too far away from the way things used to be. Now, if he's saying we're turning towards communism, this person is concerned we're moving away from capitalism, where the profit is the motive and you're trying to make money, and there really isn't all that many safety nets out there. So this is a person who is arguing against what FDR is doing by saying our principles are in capitalism, that you make, in order to make money, you have to spend money. In order to make money, you have to work for it. He's concerned that the government's getting too powerful, that we're using money too much, using government funds too much in the way of relief and not really reforming anything to get us back up and running. So this to put it in modern day terms, this would be like somebody saying we shouldn't be giving checks to people that are not working right now, because then they'll get dependent. Okay, argument that they're going to get used to it and then they're not going to want to work. Okay, so that's what this letter is basically saying. The perspective is somebody who believes in the capitalist system. Okay, so far, documents A and B have been critical. Now, keep in mind, A is before FDR ever comes into office. So is it his fault that women are not being taken care of? Not at that point, but then you've got to ask yourself, was anything done about that? We'll get to that here in a bit. Document C, the source, the Evening Star, Washington, D.C., April 26, 1934. FDR looking at these different visuals, if you will, and he says it is evolution, not revolution, gentlemen. Okay, and of course this is really weird, but it's this picture of somebody graduating and then growing into a tree, if you will, and then sprouting off all these programs. Okay, this is a very confusing political cartoon. What the author is really trying to point out here is that all of these programs are coming out of an academic kind of mentality, that this person has thought about it, and these have all grown and prospered by taking an academic approach towards government. So what this political cartoon is basically pointing to is that the government is not changing because of a revolution by Roosevelt. It's changing in a more academic approach to government. That we've thought about how we used to do things. We've thought about the principles of the United States government, and we are now sprouting new programs because we're smarter about things now. So this would be very a condemnation of the 1920s mentality of laissez-faire. Now the New Deal is producing new programs, and the government's getting more and more involved. Now, somebody would also look at this and say, hey, we are getting too far away from our capitalist roots, like document B was saying. Document D, William Lloyd Garrison Jr. If you remember, William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist during the 1800s, so this is a future generation Garrison, also showing that he's being socially involved and economically involved in that. He's writing in a magazine called The Nation in November of 1934, still in the first year of FDR's presidency. Actually, second year by that point. The New Deal being both a philosophy and a mode of action contradictory. Some assisted and some retarded the recovery of industrial activity. An enormous outpouring of federal money for human relief and immense sums for public works projects started to flow to all points of the compass. $6 billion was added to the national debt. A bureaucracy in Washington grew by leaps and bounds. And finally, to lend the picture of heightened academic touch, John Maynard Keynes of Cambridge, England, commenced the plan of buying utopia for cash. Okay, so this person is kind of pointing out the idea that the New Deal, being both a philosophy and a mode of action, began to find expression in diverse forms. Okay, sometimes contradictory. He's actually asking the question of what is the purpose of this? Are these programs, or is this a philosophy? Is this something that is, and it's kind of going against a little bit the cartoon there, is this a mode of recovering to the point we get back to what we were doing? Or is this a revolution of mentality where we're always going to do this? Which has been an argument about FDR. Because when we get done with the Great Depression, we don't go back to the way things used to be. We don't eliminate programs when they're not useful anymore. There are programs that are still around that are questionable as to whether or not we still need them. It's questionable as to whether or not the government needs to do that when the economy is doing well, or after certain conflicts go away or certain issues go away. So this is an argument of, is government getting too big, and is government doing what its intended purpose was, or has that changed completely? So it goes right back to that: are we evolving, or we're having a revolution of mentality? Document E is propaganda, okay, from the United States government. The Library of Congress gave this a monthly check to you for the rest of your life, beginning when you are 65. And they even say here, your monthly Social Security check. So this, in 1935, is the birth of Social Security. We still have Social Security. The idea is that you pay into the system throughout the time that you are working, you pay in, and then when you retire, you get the benefits. Okay, you reap the benefits. Now, when this happened, the idea was to get the elderly out of the workforce, that way more jobs were available to young people. They still do this according to say, Mr. V, you've done your service. We need you to retire. We need you to walk away from education. And that'll probably be roughly when I'm 60-ish, years of age. Even if I say, hey, I don't want to, I want to continue going until I'm 80, they're going to make it economically kind of ridiculous for me to stick around. Okay. They're going to find a way to kind of whittle me out. Why? My salary when I'm 60 probably will be equivalent to hiring two people who are 22, okay, fresh out of college. If I'm making double what a new hire would make, then what they're saying is not only do they want to get that new hire back into the workforce and working, they want to get rid of me because I'm too expensive and I've just been around for too long. Maybe I'm not as effective as I used to be. They're doing the same thing across the board with Social Security. They're saying, we want you to walk away. We want you to retire. We want you to go do other things so that young people can get involved. This is what they're trying to do. Now, when Social Security was first put into place, most people aren't living that much longer past 65. The life expectancy was not as many years as it is today. Today, the life expectancy is well into the 80s. To be on a Social Security check for 20, 30 years of their life. So life expectancy going up has actually made it very difficult for Social Security to remain solvent, meaning there aren't enough people paying into it to retire. At the time was we need to get rid of the elderly in the workforce and find another way to keep them not employed, but financed, if you will. So this is a controversial program in 1935 and a safety net that did not. Okay. Document F, Charles Evans Hughes. It says make your DBQ in May. If you see the words majority opinion, that means Supreme Court case. Okay, that means that they are deciding a Supreme Court case. Charles Evans Hughes, who was a presidential candidate in 1916, is now in 1935 on the Supreme Court. And in Schechter versus the United States in 1935, he hands down the majority opinion, which means this is representative of how the majority of the justices on the Supreme Court feel. Charles Evans Hughes says the question of chief importance relates to the provision of the codes to the hours and wages of those employed. It is plain that these requirements are imposed in order to govern the details of defendants' management of their local business. The persons employed are not employed in interstate commerce. Their wages have no direct relation to interstate commerce. The authority of the federal government may not be pushed to such an extreme. Okay, so what are they really talking about here? If you really get down to the brass tacks, the federal government cannot step in and tell you how much to pay workers. Okay, they said it was going too far. Now this is in regards to a New Deal program that basically was trying to get involved in creating a livable wage, if you will. We call it minimum wage now. Okay, but in regards to this, they were trying to make sure that workers were getting paid what they needed to survive. Okay, not just a minimum, but get paid kind of what they deserved, if you will. In the Supreme Court case, they're saying that's too much government overreach. The government cannot choose how much you make because that would be very socialistic in its integrity. So what Charles Evans Hughes and the Supreme Court are talking about here is that is going too far indeed. Now, the other event that would go along with this document, by the way, that maybe if you had, kind of done the research on the Great Depression, you would know that the Supreme Court and FDR back heads constantly because institutional New Deal programs that FDR would pass. FDR would pass these this New Deal legislation through Congress, which was overwhelmingly Democrat during the 1930s. They would pass it, rubber stamp it all the way up. He would then sign them into law, and then the Supreme Court would turn around and say, nope, too far. Now, keep in mind, most of the Supreme Court justices at that point were people that were put onto the court by Warren G. Harding, by Calvin Coolidge, and by Herbert Hoover, three Republicans, very conservative in nature. So, not surprisingly, Charles Evans Hughes, who ran against Wilson in 1916, he's a Republican. He'd be in the mindset of a Coolidge. Okay, so he's obviously with the majority of the Supreme Court saying we're not going to allow FDR to go this far with his New Deal and his programs. Now, FDR had a plan to deal with that. He called it his court packing scheme. He was going to basically say there are people on the Supreme Court that are too old to do the job. So anybody over the age, a specific age, and I think it was 80. I could don't quote me, but it was if somebody's over a specific age. I'm going to add that, for every person that's over a certain age, I'm going to add another justice up to 6. So there are 9 members of the Supreme Court. He was going to add up to 6 justices to make it 15. Now, of course, who nominates justices? If you're going to have new justices on the Supreme Court, the current president. It's FDR. So he's going to choose somebody that's pro-New Deal. And then the Congress at the time was very overwhelmingly Democrat. It's a kind of rubber stamp for him. He would just promote a Supreme Court justice. The Congress would confirm them, and they would go in to the Supreme Court to combat people like Charles Evans Hughes. Now, the media went nuts on this. The American people went nuts, and even people in Congress said, whoa, FDR, too far. That would be considered one of the main times in American history, and we've talked about there have been times where a president goes too far and has most dictatorial powers. If you're in things like this, where Evans Hughes is overruling a program that FDR had already pushed through. Document G, the NBC radio broadcast with John L. Lewis. This is where you remember that John L. Lewis is a labor leader. He's somebody that ran the American Federation of Labor. He's going to basically be pro-union at a time when the economy's not doing all that well. And in that, he said, it is the refusal of employers to grant such reasonable conditions and to deal with their employees through collective bargaining that leads to widespread labor unrest. The strikes which have broken out, especially in the automobile industry, are due to such employee trouble. Huge corporations such as U.S. Steel and General Motors have no right to transgress the law, which gives to the workers the right to self-organization and collective bargaining. Now, here's what you need to remember about this. There is a law that backs this up. The Wagner Act, passed by the senator that was written and sponsored by the senator that was in Document D. The Wagner Act is basically the act of Congress that allows for unions to become under the Wagner Act. We have the right to collect bargain. We have the right to strike. This is a big step for organized labor because if you remember, during the late 1800s, during the Gilded Age, they didn't have that right, and a lot of times it turned into violence. What John L. Lewis is saying is we legally can do this during this time period, and the government has to back us up. So John L. Lewis is kind of showing in this that, hey, I don't care what the corporations say, the government has our back when the economy turned out, okay? And could certainly argue as to whether or not that's a success. This is somebody's opinion on the New Deal in 1940. So this is right on the verge of us entering into World War II. And this is, of course, about almost 8 years, about 7.5 years after FDR took over. So the very tail end, this is right before FDR is going to seek his unprecedented return. So the government is an instrument of democratic action in the future, has always been strengthened and renovated. It is not merely a matter of the addition of many agencies, but the more efficient organization of the whole executive department, including a planning board under the president, which so far has been relatively unimportant, but is capable of future development. The courts, too, have been revised, revivified, partly by legislation, but principally by excellent new appointments, so that now we have a Supreme Court that he's moving us forward in the right direction. Okay. Hi, Roosevelt is again another editorial. So this is somebody's opinion. And of course, a publication like The Crisis doesn't sound too good. So whereas document H was positive, saying, hey, the reorganization is working, this one is actually turning towards the negative. So to declare that Roosevelt administration has tried to include the Negro in nearly every phase of its program for the people of the nation is not to ignore the instances where government policies have harmed the race. At Boulder Dam, for example, the administration continued the shameful policy begun by Hoover of forbidding Negroes to live in their government-built town at Norris Dam. The most important contribution of the Roosevelt administration to the age-old color line problem in America has been its doctrine that Negroes are a part of the country and must be considered in any program for the country as a whole. The inevitable discriminations notwithstanding, this thought has been driven home by thousands of communities by 1,000 specific acts. For the first time in their lives, government has taken on meaning and substance for the Negro masses. So this is kind of waffling back and forth. They're nailing him on this idea that, hey, African Americans have been prevented from working specific New Deal programs, but they've seen at least a little movement to where they're being accepted in certain communities. So this is whatever conclusion or thesis you're going to make. And then finally, document J, the unemployment of non-farm workers by percentage and number. So we're not talking about the Midwest. We're not talking about the Dust Bowl. We're talking about people that work in factories. What you need to recognize through this is in the early 1920s, unemployment was going up. This is in the post-World War I era. But then it went down and stayed down all the way through the Roaring 20s. So this is the good economy right here. This is where people are not losing their jobs. They're getting employment. The percentage of people in work is just fine. And then it spikes. And during the 1930s, you can see the stock market crash happens right about here. Banks start to foreclose right about here. And this right here is when you start getting the Dust Bowl. So what can you get out of this? Non-farm workers, folks, these are people that are probably arriving to the cities because they have been pushed out of their land and they have nowhere else to go except the cities to find work. So these are old farmers looking for jobs where just none exist. So you can see kind of how unemployment is going to spike, not just because of the economic downturn, but because of a change in policies and procedures when it comes to the workforce. What you can use throughout the 1930s is that unemployment in early 1933 would be right around here. So at the apex of unemployment, he takes over. The New Deal is adopted, and all of a sudden you see here where it goes back up, but then it starts going down again. Now, of course, when does unemployment reach its lowest point? Pearl Harbor happens right here in 1941, tail end of 1941. We get involved in World War II, switch to a total war front, if you will, and all of a sudden everybody's in the military and everybody's working in the factories in our total war at even lower levels than it was during the 1920s. So you're talking about a bottoming out of unemployment, which raises a question. Did the New Deal programs lead to economic recovery, or was it war that finally did it? Was actually pushing towards this over time, Or was it really our total war economy during World War II that made that a necessity? So again, you're using the documents as best you can. Okay, and of course, these documents right here, you're telling me one way or the other what the information you can get from the document, and then your point of view. What is the point of view of the argument, or the author, or the cartoonist, or whatever else? So, the last part of this, as usual, is your thesis and your supporting arguments. That would be your homework for this. Your homework would be to tell me what you think your thesis should be. Now, after you've gone through all the documents and you've got your background information, remember, you always go back to the question to make sure that your excuse me. So the question again was, analyze the responses to Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration to the problems of the Great Depression. How effective were these responses? How did they change the role of the federal government? So they're really asking you two direct questions. Was FDR a citizen? That's number one. You've got to assess that. You can say, yes, he was, programs worked and some did not. Now, remember, I am saying this in a non-academic fashion right now. Your thesis statement, the way I just said it. The second question you have to address is that question: they change the role of the federal government? Politics, was it a blanket change? Remember, we talked earlier, is this really a shift from capitalism to communism or socialism, if you don't want to go that far? Or is this just a minor aberration and we've switched back? You'd have to make those arguments based upon what you know and based upon the documents that are presented to you here. Now, that being said, after all that, are there any questions? You can either chat them or you can unmute and ask. All right, here's the deal. This question was by far one of the hardest questions ever posed by the College Board, because it went specifically after an economic question. Economic questions, in my mind, are always the hardest ones to answer, because it's asking the person not only what you know about the politics, but what you know about the monetary situation of the United States. This could be answered in a multitude of ways. In my mind, this was a very politically charged question, because they are kind of asking you your perception of what the government's role is when it comes to the economy. If you're a laissez-faire conservative, you're going to answer it one way. If you're a liberal, kind of maybe socialist, if you will, you're certainly going to answer it in another way. So do I expect a question like this time around? No. And I certainly, and I was talking with the Coleraine teacher, Coleraine's AP teacher, John Dowling, yesterday. Dowling and I both believe that this year, under our circumstances, they're not going to ask a question from Unit 7, even though that's the tail end. I don't see them asking a question, neither did he, about world wars or 1920s or 1930s America, just because even though we theoretically got to it, we didn't go in depth the way it was necessary in order to actually get you prepared for the exam. So both he and I are of strong opinion that the AP question you get is not going to be from Unit 7. Both of us really honestly believe it's going to be from Units 5. Unit 5 would be basically the Civil War through Reconstruction, or even into the Gilded Age. Both of us kind of believe it's going to be the late 1800s, because that allows them to put it right in the middle and allow for you to show a cause and effect relationship. We also believe that this could be the year that they ask you a question about immigration, race relations, or women's rights, because all three of those were big during that time period. Obviously, when it comes to immigration, you have a vast, you know, a vast wave of immigration necessitating us building Ellis Island up as a immigration way station and Angel Island out in the Pacific Ocean in San Francisco to kind of monitor the influx of this massive tide of immigrants. But you also have laws that say, well, we don't want Chinese people in the Chinese Exclusion Act. We want a quota on certain people coming into the country. You know, whether it be Italians, whether it be you know, people from Eastern Europe, there are going to be laws in the books that are kind of in response to this wave of immigration during the late 1800s. When it comes to race relations, obviously the granting of rights to former slaves with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment is then going to inspire the South to have things like Jim Crow laws on the heels of the Black Codes during the Reconstruction era. And then, of course, for women's rights, obviously it's the suffragette movement, moving from, hey, we worked as a society, and then, of course, fought a war to rid the nation of slavery, and yet women are still not granted the right to tender a vote. And, of course, that's going to happen all the way through the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Now, again, John and I could be totally wrong. You know, you could theoretically get your email on March 15th, open it up, and it could be a Revolutionary War question, or it very well could be the 1930s. All I'm trying to point out to you is that we honestly, and it's on all of our message boards too, everybody's kind of been talking about how the College Board would be really diabolical to hit you with a question that's at the very tail end of what we talked about in class. That being said, I still wanted to give you a question on the Great Depression and New Deal, so at least you had some awareness of it prior to the exam, just in case it comes up. The only way I could see this topic coming up is if they ask you about economics in regards to government, meaning how much control should the government have? What I mean by that is, are they going to ask a question that compares the trusts and the monopolies of the late 1800s, where there was no government control, to FDR's policies of saying, hey, we need safety nets to protect people from these corporations, and more importantly, the economy as a whole. So again, I could see that as really being the only way this comes up, but you need to be ready just in case that comes up, okay? Again, a reminder, the AP exam goes from units 1 through 7. You don't need to worry about anything World War II and beyond. You don't need to know about the Cold War, Civil Rights Movement, modern day America. Those are out, okay? So again, it's units 1 through 7 is what you need to be focused on in your 5 steps to a 5. Okay, so if you're going to do your 5 steps to a 5 book, the focus should be on those 7 units. And again, in talking with John, he and I are both in agreement that it's probably going to be a thematic question as opposed to just one of those units. We think it's going to be something that can be a concept that can be spread across multiple units, meaning it could be causes of war. It could be the United States' place in the world. It could be immigration. It could be human rights. It could be civil rights. It could be women's rights. It could be the extension of voting rights. It could be economic policies and procedures. It could be any number of those things. Don't worry about that so much now, but if you're going to start studying, make sure you're focusing on trying to build up a good kind of timeline, if you will, of when everything occurred of substance, so that when we get to the thematic stuff, it's not to where you're drawing a blank of how, all right, so the theme of the question is, let's say, civil rights. Can you link the early American, the Constitution era to antebellum era, to Civil War era, to Reconstruction era? Can you link a kind of general progression of where African Americans stood in American history in all of those facets, to where you can show a general progression of either rights or racism or regional differences or whatever the case may be. And we will go over that as much as we possibly can in that final week, where we do nothing but kind of prep, where we hold these sessions every day, and they'll be optional, but we'll hold these sessions where you bring questions, but I also present kind of some conceptual topics that could come up on the AP exam. It's a lot of talking, and I apologize, but the reason that I talk so much and didn't kind of hit you up with questions is, A, there's only 4 of you in here. I assume that's mostly because it's a Friday, and I appreciate you taking the time to come in. But B, we hadn't gone over this in class. So it'd be unfair for me to say, hey, who's Huey Long? Because you may not have covered that in your book yet. You may not have gotten around to watching the PowerPoint over that yet. Again, those PowerPoints are still on your Google Classroom, as are the notes for the unit. So you can look through that at your leisure. And of course, you can look through the book. But again, everything you need is up to Unit 7, and that's it. All right. Questions, comments, concerns? All right. So the worksheet, again, you're getting graded on literally the attempt at doing a thesis statement. You're not going to get knocked points-wise if your thesis statement is not solid. What I want you to focus on is attempting to write as solid a thesis statement as you could for these questions, so that I can kind of show you how to tweak them to be solid, okay? So do realize when you turn it in, as long as you have everything filled out, and as long as you made a pretty good faith effort, and obviously if you're attending these things, it's going to go a long way, you're getting 50 points out of 50 for doing the effort. I'm returning them with suggestions on what you can do to bolster either your argument or your thesis in regards to how you're presenting your argument. So please go through this with the mentality of, I'm trying to make the best thesis I can, not for the points for the class. You're going to get the points regardless. What I'm pushing for at this point is to hone your skills at writing a thesis to make sure you're getting ready for that eventuality of May 15th, writing your own. And on a side note, Ariel, yours was fantastic the last time. There's no pressure on this time. I don't expect it to be perfect every single time, but that was real growth when it came to your writing. So I want to give you props on that one. Hannah, you're usually right there when it comes to your thesis statement. It's usually just minor little tweaks. So I think both of you are going to do just fine. Francis, I would have feedback for you if I had your stuff. So let's make sure we're turning it in. Go back and make sure 1 and 2 get in ASAP so that I can provide you feedback on those issues. Again, we are filming these so that you can go back and look at the how I'm walking through this and what you should know and all that to fill out these things. So in case you miss something, it's good review. But I also expect you to come in with questions too. So hopefully you'd already kind of been filling this one out. So that you weren't sitting there typing everything as fast as I was going through. But again, make sure that you're getting these done and filled out so that you have these to review from, because if nothing else, it's going to be good review for the time frames that we've covered so far. Now, obviously, the modern day question we start off with won't be any help whatsoever. So DBQ 1 isn't really going to help you all that much because it was modern America and it's off limits, if you will. But every DBQ, like I said, the next 3 that we do, we're doing 6 total. All 3 of them will be from the time period that is fair game. And I'm going to try and make the one that I post over the weekend that'll be due next week. And we'll have one of these powwows next Tuesday when we have.
But that's.
I'm sorry. So next Tuesday we'll have one of these at 2 o'clock as usual. Over DBQ4. I'm going to try and post that over the weekend so you have time to work on it beforehand. I'm going to try and make DBQ4 more of a thematic one on a concept that stretches between time frames so that you can get a better understanding of what I mean when something stretches, if you will, that it's more of a concept than it is a time frame. So far, we've just been kind of doing time frames. Questions, comments, concerns?
I would have joined earlier if the notification from Classroom that there was one starting, because I hadn't opened the DBQ3 to see that there was going to be a meeting today. It came through half an hour late, so I didn't see it. That's why I wasn't here.
Google was running a little slow today, and my internet has been spotty at best, so my apologies. I will try and make sure that I post over the weekend, and I'm telling you right now, next Tuesday at 2 will be when we have the meeting over DBQ4, and I'm going to try and have that posted either later on this evening or early tomorrow, so that you have time to look over it before Tuesday.
All right, thank you.
You're very welcome. If you have any questions, you can stay back and ask. If you don't, have a great weekend. Stay healthy, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you for coming in and spending time working on this today.